button now and share screen now and full screen now. Okay, here we are. I am assuming everybody can see this. For as long as I've been teaching here, and that started in 1997, so I've been here a while. This is not my first rodeo. And I don't know what all of your backgrounds are, except that most of you are not particularly interested in being biology majors. We've always got a few in this class that are thinking about majoring in biology, but maybe aren't sure or want to dip a toe in the water. But most of you, I'm assuming that biology does not play a very large role in your career goals. And we always get students, and we have for a long time, who really don't appreciate having to take what we now call the core curriculum, what used to be called general education here. One moment. Yes, sir. Okay. Okay. The power's going to go out for a minute or two. Is there any way you can wait? Or could you do that? Okay, it's not the can you do it after 11? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you. All right. Sorry, folks. I don't know if you heard all of that, but that was a guy showing up who needs to switch out our electrical meter, which would mean our power would go out for a few minutes, which obviously we don't want to have happen in the middle of lecture. Anyway, so yeah, he'll be coming back at a time when your educational experience does not get messed with. Right. So there's always people who really don't care to take the core classes because they don't see them as particularly relevant to their future. So I guess about 12 years ago, somebody had this to say in the Echo, that these classes weren't for every student. And then about, soon after, most students thought that the general education program, what they used to call, that's the old name for what's now the core, the answer would be pointless. So most of you folks are not deeply in love with biology, which is okay. You don't have to love this stuff. We're all different people. We all have different likes and dislikes. I could try to tell you that biology is often absolutely gorgeous, that living things are beautiful and complex and breathtaking sometimes. Or I could talk about how you need to know biology because it's useful. It's the foundation, for example, of healthcare. Or I could tell you that it will help you make informed decisions about complex issues in our world today, like threats that we hear about, like global climate change and, among other things, the increased risk of wildfires, which we will talk about towards the very end of the course. Or certainly ever since this pandemic thing started, most of you have probably learned more than you really wanted to know about aspects of biology like viruses and the immune system and things like that. And those are certainly things where what we desperately need is people who can make calm, rational, and informed decisions instead of flipping out about microchips and 5G and Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all of that. But screw that. Most of you are probably here in hopes of getting a better job once you're out of here. And that's perfectly okay too. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have a good job and earn good money and work at something that gives you satisfaction. Nothing wrong with that in the world. And most of you probably don't think your jobs are going to have much to do with biology. Here's why you need to know this anyway. Only 27% of US college graduates are getting jobs that are related to their majors. At least that was true about 8 years ago. I haven't been able to find more updated stats. The statistics are always, lagging behind the current situation. But just because you have majored in accounting is absolutely no guarantee that a job in accounting is going to be waiting for you with open arms. I mentioned that I've been teaching since 1991. My undergrad days were in the late 80s. And I can already tell you a lot of the fields that looked safe when I was an undergrad have pretty much disappeared now, mostly because of our friend, the internet. You've all seen how the internet has sent shockwaves through everything from retail to journalism to music. All of these fields have been completely upended. Jobs have been lost, but jobs have been gained as well. Back when I was in an undergrad, nobody could have predicted that there would be such a thing as a corporate chief information officer. So we've got everything from, image consultants and brand influencers all the way to cybersecurity. And all of that stuff didn't exist back in my day. And the pace of change does not show signs of slowing down anytime soon. The job that you think might be ideal for you could end up next year being completely outsourced to computers or possibly to workers in Uzbekistan or something like that. The people who are 50 today held an average of 11.7 different jobs from ages 18 to 48, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The old model where you get your college degree and you join a company and you rise through the corporate ranks and you retire at 65 with a gold watch and a pension, that's dead. Those days are never coming back for almost all jobs that there are. This pattern seems to be holding true. What I hear people call the current economy is permanent whitewater, and that was even before the coronavirus and the current political weirdness that's currently going on. Even before that, these were, typical of the labor market in this day and age. And given that that's the case, the worst thing we could do is make you take courses only in your major or only in what you're interested in. You can't be a specialist in one single field. That would be educational malpractice. Make your mind a Swiss Army knife. You need a range of different skills, different experiences, familiarity with different ways of understanding, not even so much different ranges of facts that you've got memorized, but different tricks you can make your mind do, different ways of reasoning on data. And the best way to do that, the best way we can prepare you for a crazy world like we're in, is to give you at least some exposure to as many different fields as possible. I compared this once to imagine UCA's sports program was run like this. We got all of our athletes and we assigned them to sports at random, and the assignments changed every week. So one day somebody is playing football. The next week he's got to run track. The week after that, he's got to play baseball. And the week after that, he's playing tennis. Right? Imagine that the sports are changing every week and they're changing at random. Under those circumstances, it wouldn't make sense to get too specialized. There's no sense in specializing at being a wide receiver if next week you could be playing shortstop. But there is a certain amount of cross-training that you could do. Any athlete can benefit from strength and conditioning, building up endurance, trying to work on coordination, things like that. So whatever your career plans are, think of biology as part of the cross-training. Think of this class as being like skipping rope or pumping iron or something like that. Even if you never pick up a book on biology ever again, what's really important for you to take is not so much facts. You can always look those up. You know, if 4 years from now you can't remember that a typical human cell has 46 chromosomes, I won't be too upset about that. You can always look up the chromosome number if you need to. What is important is that you've got some sense of why that matters, how we know, and how that fits into bigger pictures, and how you can take factoids like that and build them up and make them do something. So the way we take facts and build them up and make them do something is called the scientific method. And I put scientific method with a little plural there, scientific methods, because there's no single formula that every scientist uses. There are variations on this. Individuals can sometimes depart from this method and sometimes get away with it. There's no one cookie cutter formula that you can always attach to every scientific endeavor. But this will give you a pretty good idea of how we do it. Back in the days when we would meet in person, I'd actually give students a quiz and tell everybody to write down 10 facts about your left thumb. So I'm holding up my own left thumb now. And one fact is that it's got little ridges on the thumbprint. And another fact is that it's got a little scar where the cat scratched me on the knuckle. And another is the fact that the fingernail is cut fairly short. And another fact is that it's got some wrinkles on it. And another fact is just as the base, there's a really nasty scar from where I hit myself with a rock hammer many years ago, and so on. And you could all do the same. You could sit and stare at your left thumb and write down fact after fact after fact about your left thumb. The problem is you probably wouldn't be doing anything remotely useful, right? If you were staring at your left thumb and writing down fact after fact, you'd probably find that to be a waste of time, right? Certainly nobody is going to want to read a book of 1,001 facts about your left thumb. That's by way of illustrating the fact that science does depend on gathering facts, whether you're just staring at your thumb or looking through a microscope or using much more complicated apparatus. You ultimately depend on observing the world around you. That's very important, but that can't be the whole story. For one thing, for an observation to be valid, you have to make it reproducible, meaning anyone should be able to see the same thing that you did. If you have an astronomer who's studying the sky in a telescope and sees something, maybe a star exploding or something like that, he has to report what he or she has seen so that anybody else in the world can aim their telescope at the same spot in the sky and see the same thing that the first guy saw. If you're doing an experiment on, to pick a completely random example, if we're doing an experiment on vaccines and you do a test of a vaccine, anyone in the world should be able to repeat the test and get the same results. But more importantly, you can't do science by only gathering facts. A much more intelligent scientist than I will ever be, a French guy by the name of Jules-Henri Poincaré, once said that science is built of facts the way a house is built of stones, but a pile of stones is not a house, and a pile of facts isn't science. You can't just sit around and do nothing but gather fact after fact after fact after fact after fact. You have to have some sort of guide for what you're supposed to gather. That's the point of the whole left thumb exercise. I could stare at my left thumb and probably write down 100 different facts about my left thumb. But what would that be for? What would the purpose of it be? How could I tell when I had enough facts? How could I tell which of those facts might actually be interesting? How can I take that pile of facts and actually build a house out of it? I need some sort of guide to tell me what facts I'm going to go out and observe, because the number of things that I could observe is practically infinite. And I need some kind of way of telling myself which ones are going to matter. Now, you can gather facts, you can gather a bunch of specific details and try to generalize from them into a general law of nature. And we call this type of reasoning induction. What would a good example be? If I pet my cat on the belly and the cat claws me, which she does, and then I do it again and she claws me again, and I do it again and she claws me again, I could finally say, okay, it's a general rule of cat behavior that they don't like having their bellies touched. That would be a case of induction, where I'm taking a bunch of specific facts, specific instances of messing with my cat, and generalizing from that to a general rule that covers, lots of cats everywhere. Speaking of messing with cats, but we can do better than that. We don't depend solely on induction. What's often called the scientific method is the hypothetico-deductive method, using the opposite type of reasoning called deduction. So let's say you observe something you would like an explanation for. It could be anything from why is the sky blue to why is my cat trying to kill me to why are people dying of this strange lung disease, anything like that. We observe something that we don't have a good explanation for, and we formulate a possible explanation for it, a possible statement as to how that aspect of the world might work, and we call that a hypothesis. Very often, instead of formulating just one hypothesis, you'll try to formulate several. That's called the method of multiple working hypotheses. And the reason why you do that is people who haven't done it sometimes think science is not a creative kind of endeavor. It's this very rational, left-brained, cut and dry thing where you speak with a lot of long words and use expensive equipment. And I'll tell you that coming up with a good hypothesis, a beautiful hypothesis, one that works really well, that's a creative act. It's just as creative as coming up with a beautiful song or a beautiful painting. And just like artists tend to love what they create, scientists do too. And it's very easy to get really, really attached to this awesome hypothesis that you've got, and really want to hang on to it and really want to believe it and really cling to it even when there's lots of evidence against it. And to try to immunize oneself against that, we often try to come up with several possible hypotheses, and that's as a way to keep from getting too attached to any single one. What you do with the hypothesis is you deduce consequences of it. Let's say my hypothesis is that there is a virus going around that is transmitted through respiration, specifically through the droplets that people produce when they cough, sneeze, talk, or sing. That's your hypothesis. You would deduce from that things like, if that hypothesis is true, then if I wear a mask, I am not likely to get sick. And if I don't wear a mask, I am much more likely to get sick. Okay, that's an if-then statement. If this hypothesis is true, then I can deduce there is an effect that I should see. So you deduce predictions about what you should observe if the hypothesis is true. That's why this is the hypothetico-deductive method. Deduction, you start with a general idea and work out specific consequences of that. So if I have a general idea that cats do not like their bellies rubbed, then I can deduce that if I sneak up on my cat and try to rub his belly, I will probably end up losing blood. That would be an example of deduction. You're going from a general idea to a specific, whereas in induction, you're going from specific to general. And as I've said, science has a reputation of being soulless, and people don't always think of it as being creative. But I promise you, coming up with a really good hypothesis is just as hard and takes just as much work as coming up with a beautiful painting or an elegant dance move or a really smooth bass line like James Jamerson is laying down over here. If you don't know who James Jamerson is, you really should. Okay, so great. Now what? You put your hypothesis or hypotheses through some kind of test. On Monday, we'll talk about the type of test that's probably best known, the formal experiment. Experiments have to follow certain rules in order to be valid, and we'll talk about that on Monday. There are some hypotheses that are hard to test by experiment. Just by way of example, if you're an astronomer and you're studying stars exploding, you can't really come up with hypotheses about exploding stars that you could test in a lab because we can't make stars in a laboratory. And if we did and they exploded, then we probably wouldn't have a laboratory anymore, or probably wouldn't have a planet anymore. So there are some fields where we can't really do formal experiments that check all of the boxes that a real experiment needs to check. So we can sometimes test hypotheses through less controlled methods of observation. So if you have a hypothesis about why stars explode, you can't make that happen in your laboratory in an experiment, but you can scan the skies and look for stars that might be exploding and try to use information from those to test your hypothesis. In some instances, you can test your hypothesis using modeling. You would see this a lot in things like engineering. Let's say you design a particular type of building. You could say, my hypothesis is that this type of building should be able to withstand winds of a certain speed. And then you could test that by building a small model of your building and putting it in a wind tunnel, for example. Or you could hypothesize that a particular type of airplane will be more fuel efficient, and you could put that to the test by building a model of the airplane and putting it in a wind tunnel or something like that. Modeling can be done by building, physical models. These days, we do a lot of modeling using computers. We can, model the behavior of the real world quite well. But with one of those methods, you have to put your hypothesis through some kind of a test. You see what the results of the test are, and then the hypothesis is either rejected if the predictions you made from the hypothesis don't match what you see in the real world. You reject your hypothesis. Maybe you can try to revise it a little bit, but in the form that you were testing it, the hypothesis is dead. Or you can provisionally accept your hypothesis. You can say, this looks like this worked out. But if you're doing science, your hypothesis must always be subject to further testing. You can't just stop and say, okay, we have enough information, we don't need to study this anymore. Our hypothesis is absolutely and unquestioningly true. All hypotheses are always subject to further testing. Every so often, not all that often, but now and again, what we thought was a very well-supported hypothesis actually turns out to have been incorrect. Someone does an experiment of the right kind in the right way and shows that our old hypothesis that we thought was so great really isn't that great after all. That's just one of the things that happens. There are things that I was taught a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, specifically in that big lecture hall in Percival Stern Hall back in the fall of 1987. There's some things that I learned about biology that now we know are not correct, and we've had to drop those hypotheses and come up with better ones. That's the way science goes. It's constantly reshaping itself. You've all kind of had a ringside seat to that process during the coronavirus pandemic. You might have noticed that recommendations as to what you should do and whether kids can get this or not, and whether or not masks are effective, get argued about a lot. And sometimes even people like Dr. Fauci, who is a very good scientist, has had to revise his opinion. And this is just the way things go. This is how science always happens. It usually doesn't happen with millions of people watching. Arguments like this usually get made out of the public eye. But in this case, you've actually had a pretty good ringside seat to the process of how science gets done, and it tends to be messy. What isn't science is a hypothesis that cannot be tested. Hypotheses that can be tested can include some really weird ones. I could say right now, I hypothesize that there are elves living in my medicine chest in the bathroom that are singing and dancing and playing Never Gonna Give You Up. Okay, that's a wacky hypothesis, but you can test it, right? You could go back to my bathroom and say, hey, wait a minute, I didn't see any elves in your medicine cabinet. And that would have tested the hypothesis and disproved it. We'd have to reject the hypothesis that there are elves in my medicine cabinet. So hypotheses can be goofy. That's not what's important. What's important is whether you can test them. If I'd said that there are elves in my medicine cabinet, but nobody else can see them, that would be an untestable hypothesis, and that would no longer be science. Whoops, sorry. I'll have more to say later about what a formal experiment really is. A well-designed experiment demonstrates the effect on a system of changing one or a small number of things we call variables, and I'll talk more about that on Monday. And you'll see how this works in the first lab that you do. And as I've said, for some things that scientists study, we can't do experiments directly. It may be impossible, it may be impractical, it might be illegal or unethical. What you're looking at is a picture taken through the Hubble Space Telescope of a cloud of gas called the Crab Nebula. You could actually see this from right now in the night sky with a telescope, albeit not in this kind of detail. And we believe it's the remains of an exploding star, or a star that already has exploded. In fact, as seen from Earth, it exploded almost 1,000 years ago. And we think this is the, expanding cloud of gas that was left behind. We can't directly experiment on this thing because it's thousands of light years away and dozens of light years across, and we can't make stars explode in the laboratory, but we can observe in different ways different aspects of the Crab Nebula, not just with light, but with things like X-ray sources as well. And we can observe and record as many different variables as we can and try to use that to test hypotheses. And in other cases, we can build models. These two pictures that you see are computer models of the moon crashing into the Earth. Up there at the top, you can see the moment where the moon has impacted right onto the Earth. And then below, that blue ball with a great big smudge on it is the result of the moon crashing into the Earth. The different colors represent different zones of temperature. You can see down there at the bottom, that blue sphere has that red and orange cap. Basically, that's an ocean of lava covering about 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Obviously, we would not want to do this experiment even if we could, but we can test various aspects of hypotheses of, the effects of the moon crashing into the Earth by making computer models. Much safer, and everybody survives. And Aerosmith doesn't do a ballad. Don't know if you got that, but there was that movie about an asteroid hitting the Earth, and the only thing I remember is that Aerosmith did "I Don't Want to Miss a Thing." Yeah, Aerosmith can stay home, and we can test these things by computer models. Most fields of science will actually use some combination of the three. You might test a hypothesis with experiments or observations or models. Sometimes you can use more than one. Good scientists can kind of jump back and forth between them. But ultimately, every hypothesis either has to be supported, in which case you hang on to it, or you reject it. If you have a hypothesis that has really been through the ringer, that has been repeatedly tested, repeatedly confirmed, and that's applicable in a very wide range of situations, you might call it a theory. Now, I've talked to people before who think theory means wild guess that somebody pulled out of his butt. I'm not entirely sure why, but theory does not actually mean wild-ass guess that somebody pulled out of his butt. I might blame old horror movies. My theory is that we can implant brain of insane gorilla into head of account executive. No, that's not what theory means. There isn't any absolute proof in science. If anybody tells you that science has proved that heartaches are healed by the sea, as Garth Brooks once said, if anyone tells you science has proved anything, slap them. They're not telling you the truth. Any theory that's interesting goes beyond what we've been able to test so far, and there's always a chance that some test that we haven't done might falsify the theory, might knock it down. It does not happen very often, but every so often it does. Because any theory that's good is going to extend into situations that we can't imagine yet. Any theory that is going to be any good how do I want to put this, is going to apply to situations we haven't encountered. But the tests of our hypotheses that we can make are limited in space and time. We can't test, like gravity, good theory right there. We can test the theory of gravity, and we can do it in lots of ways. But there's always a chance that at some time in the future, gravity will stop working the way we think it does. Or maybe there was a time in the past when gravity didn't work the way that we think it does. So there's always a chance we could test what we thought was a very solid finding and find out that it doesn't really hold water as well as we thought it did. So we can disprove theories. You never get to absolute proof. You do get reliability. The theory of gravity is only a theory, but it has been tested so often in situations ranging from the flight of a fastball to putting satellites in orbit and sending space probes to Pluto. It's been tested so much that it's probably true. There's always a chance that we might come up with a case in which we have to modify our theory of gravity. So you never get absolute certainty. I knew someone once who said, I became a scientist because I wanted to understand truth. That's kind of like becoming the Pope in order to meet girls. This is just not the kind of thing that we do. Any good science is always going to be subject to further revision as time goes by. But theory does not mean random assumption that some dope in a white lab coat pulled out of thin air. Theory means a hypothesis that's been tested so well that we can take it as very reliable. That doesn't mean it won't someday have to be torn down and modified. In fact, our older theory of gravity ended up getting torn down and revolutionized by a fellow named Albert Einstein that you might have heard of. Every now and then that happens. And it may happen to some of the things that I'm teaching in here. But what we go for is not absolute truth, but reliability and flexibility. And I want to show you, just while we're still here, I don't think we have much time, but I'll show you an example of this that actually happened fairly recently. Those are some brain cells. My college roommate killed a whole lot of those because he rushed Pi Kappa Alpha. And it was common knowledge when I was in college that after infancy, your brain quit adding new cells. You could lose brain cells, especially at Pike or Delta Tau Delta in particular. And maybe you could compensate for losing brain cells. People do make recoveries from brain injuries, but you could never grow new ones. After you were about 9 months old, I think, you had, no more. You had all of the brain cells you were ever going to have, and it was just downhill from there. That's what I learned back in the day. There have been a number of studies that have shown that that's not entirely true, but I'm going to focus on a study of the people that drive these. This is a cab, a taxi, in the city of London, England. There's a small piece of the streets of London. It's huge, and the street network consists of 25,000 streets, very few of them at right angles. Some cities are laid out like checkerboards. London sprawls. The streets meet at all kinds of angles. Some of them are one way. At any given moment, some of them are under construction or blocked off or being rerouted or something like that. And there are many thousands of places where someone taking a taxi might want to go. Hotels, embassies, government buildings, tourist attractions, museums, thousands of places where somebody might want you to take them. So to be a licensed cab driver in London, you have to build up a mental map of 36 square miles of central London that all looks like this. Okay, we still there? Okay, there. Not sure why, but I think you can see now. And it usually takes 3 to 4 years to memorize the street arrangements of central London. And people take exams on this. Nobody passes the first go around. I think it takes something like 20 attempts before the average person passes. Okay, so what? There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus, buried deep in the brain. We already knew that that area was larger. Well, we already knew that area was involved in forming long-term memory because people that damage their hippocampus because of surgery or stroke or things like that may lose the ability to form new memories. But it was found by doing scans. These are virtual slices through the brain. No actual brains were harmed in this. It turns out the hippocampus is larger in qualified London cab drivers than in dropouts or in people who've never driven a cab in London. Okay, that could just mean that people who become cabbies naturally have bigger hippocampi in their heads. But it turns out that the volume of your hippocampus grows between the start of training and the end of training. On the left of this graph, you can see there's 2 bars, one light gray and one dark gray. The light gray is the size of the hippocampus at the beginning of a cabbie's training. The dark gray is its size once the training is done. You see that in successful cabbies. You don't see that in people that have dropped out, and you don't see that in the columns labeled controls. That's the people that have never driven cabs at all. That's just people from random occupations who've never gotten near a taxi, right? You see, their hippocampi don't grow. They do in people that are actively working on memorizing this enormous mental map of London. And so further studies have confirmed that the brain is capable of adding new brain cells. At least parts of it can, maybe not the whole brain, but we now know that the brain can constantly rewire itself and remodel itself, and at least some parts of a healthy brain do in fact add new cells throughout life. So the old stuff that I learned back in 1987, back in my hair metal days, turned out to be incorrect. And we've replaced it by something that's more accurate. And I think you can see this is very interesting to know. If we can work out how the brain can add new cells, that might lead to new treatments for things like traumatic brain injury. Certainly the work is not finished, and there's a lot more to learn, and we'll never completely run out of things to know, which is the cool thing about science. You can't run out of interesting questions. But that's an example of what we thought was well understood being torn down and replaced with something better. Science does not get things right the first time. There have been idiots who've done science, and bigots, close-minded, arrogant twits, lying pieces of criminal filth, even the occasional frauds. There have been real scientific frauds and crooks. I've met people like that before. And even good scientists make mistakes. We're not super people. You know, we are human. You know, we are limited in what we can observe and conceive of and think and reason. The process of science itself, though, is self-correcting. Ultimately, hypotheses that don't fit get torn down or modified, and you can have cons and frauds and conspiracies and things like that that might last a while. Ultimately, they get questioned, and in the end, they get exposed, and we end up dropping them. All right, by the power vested in me, I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording.